just one solitary discourse. Rather, it's a bunch of different forms of discourse that work together, that paint a larger picture of the way that women should look in our culture. So some specific instances of these discourse fragments. Fashion models and magazines, I'm sure you know. There are big debates about this, about models being too thin on the runway. And I believe in Spain recently, they wanted to ban thin models because they thought it was misrepresentative of the way women actually look in their culture. Actresses, if you compare the body type of actresses like a Marilyn Monroe or other actresses in the 1950s and 60s to actresses who are really popular now, you'll see that they've completely slimmed down. And a lot of times their weight is an issue of concern. I remember before Brittany Murphy's death, people were always commenting on how thin that she was. Also, weight loss commercials that we see on television focus on specific problem areas so that even thin people are implicated by the discourse. Even people who are real thin are made to feel like they have some part of their body that they need to perfect. Like maybe they're looking at their thighs and saying, well, my thighs are a little bit big, or I have a little bit of a spare tire or love handles that I need to work on, or gosh, look at my toes. My toes are toe beasts. I need to work on my toes. So every single person in our culture, no matter how thin they are, they're implicated. So one of the really insidious things about the tyranny of slenderness is a paradox that emerges. Not only does the media demonize the obese person, they also demonize the anorexic person. So women really can't win in our culture when you look at the mass media. So it's either a magazine cover that features Kirstie Alley that says, oh my gosh, Kirstie Alley is at a monstrous 220 pounds. She's eating her way through West Hollywood. Or the next week, you'll pick up an Us Weekly that will feature actresses like 90210's Shanae Grimes saying, she's too thin for TV. She's ordered to gain weight. Co-stars are performing an intervention. Co-stars are also saying, I never see her eat. So, like I said, it's kind of a catch-22. You can't win. You're either too big or too small, which shows that women and men are really put in this perpetual state of disarray when it comes to their body images. Now, going back to the point that discourse makes the normative appear normal, I want to briefly bring up an application of a French philosopher named Jean Baudrillard that Bourdieu does in Unbearable Weight when she's discussing the tyranny of slenderness. And what Bourdieu argues that media representations a lot of times aren't a mirror of reality. Instead, they simulate a reality. They come up with a copy of reality that people confuse as the real thing. So when we see super thin models and actresses, we know that they don't represent average everyday people that we see in classrooms or on the street or in the mall. They just don't look anything like them. Their bodies, like the clothing size that models wear, aren't representative of what average everyday women wear in their day-to-day lives. They wouldn't be able to fit into that clothing. But we've really flipped the copy and what the copy is meant to represent in our culture. So the map, if the map is the model, and the territory, if the territory is the human body, have switched places. So what average everyday women look at in magazines, they begin to say, that's normative, that's natural, that's what I should look like. I feel bad for not looking like that. So what happens is they begin to alter the terrain of their bodies by way of surgery, plastic surgery, weight loss, fads, where they're actually starving their bodies to look like the model in the magazine when the model should look like average everyday women. So it's akin to if you took out a map and you saw on the map that there was supposed to be a street, but then you looked at the territory and you said, well, gosh, there's not a street there where the map tells me there should be a street. It would be like saying, okay, we need to bring in the bulldozers and change the territory so it looks like the map. That's what's happened with women's bodies and images of women that are popular in magazines. And what we know from magazines with airbrushing is not even the women in the magazines, not even the models look like that. They're airbrushed. Fact, weight-related aesthetic standards vary from culture to culture. So what is considered to be a beautiful weight in the United States, if you go into another country, is not deemed to be a beautiful weight. And it's important to take into consideration the intersections of class, gender, and weight expectations. Because in a number of cultures where a more robust figure is valued and celebrated in that culture, a lot of that has to do with class-related issues. So in poorer countries where poor people can't afford food every day, rich women and rich men will gorge themselves with food to show their class status, because if they're overweight, or what we would consider to be overweight in the United States, then that proves to everyone around them how much money they have. Now you look at the United States, where we pretty much have an abundance of food compared to a lot of developing nations, but the food that's most readily available to poor people or people of lower socioeconomic brackets is going to be food that's not necessarily that great for them. Processed food, food that comes from cans and boxes, fast food. All of these things change the shape of the human body and make it larger. That's why there's an obesity epidemic in the United States. So not surprisingly, rich people, to perform their status, will make themselves look thin. They will come off as very skinny and thin because that's the way that they're performing their class status. So beauty as it relates to gender is definitely a social construct, and we know this by comparing different cultural expectations when it comes to beauty and figures. Most people featured in magazines are not average. Discourse, like Baudrillard tells us, simply constructs the illusion that they are normative and thus normal, everyday, and average. But again, going back to that maps and territories metaphor, the map doesn't represent the territory anymore. So people had to deal with a lot of different contradictory messages. And now we're going to kind of jump back to our discussion of how different institutions with which we're affiliated will tell us different types of ways that we should live our lives and how we should correctly perform our gender. And a lot of times, different institutions with which we're affiliated will give us competing, contradictory messages. So we have these things called discursive ruptures that emerge salient in our day-to-day lives. And these are when different discourses contradict one another. Discursive ruptures expose the extent to which we constantly are constructing and maintaining our gender realities. So if you kick back to the social construction of reality lecture that we did last time, you'll remember that we're constantly in our day-to-day lives undergoing reality maintenance because we have a lot of messages that reinforce our values and beliefs regarding gender, but a number of different messages that also contradict our values. So whenever we have a message that contradicts our values and beliefs and gendered expectations, we have to find a way to clear up this rupture somehow to maintain our realities. And I'm going to discuss two examples that illustrate discursive rupturing. The first is going to deal with a 19th century intersexed individual who at the time was known as a hermaphrodite, known as Herculine Barban, who wrote really lengthy diaries of her experiences. And the second example that we're going to discuss is going to be a little bit more topical and contemporary, and that's going to be the gay marriage debate currently going on. So we'll start with Herculine Barban. Herculine was born a hermaphrodite, who we would now call as an intersexed individual, in the mid-19th century, specifically 1838. Herculine was raised in a convent as a girl because, as you know, a lot of times when a baby is born intersexed, doctors and parents feel compelled, or caregivers, not even just parents, feel compelled to make the child fit into a gender binary that doesn't adequately represent what that baby is. So if the baby is born with ambiguous genitalia, the doctor will try to make some type of determination of whether they want the child to be male or female, rather than just letting it be what it naturally is, intersexed. And don't you know, whenever they have stories like this on Oprah or Montel Williams or talk shows, they always get it wrong. When they assign either male or female to the intersexed individual always ends up identifying with the other sex more. So she was raised in a convent as a girl, and while she was in the convent, she fell in love with her best female friend. So in her late 20s, the French court intervened and